Okay, here we go. Our second unit of American History 2. So we are just moving right along. I can't believe we've already done a whole unit. So the second unit isn't super long. It's not long in terms of days, but it is long in terms of content covered. We're going to talk about a lot of people and a lot of things. So I'm sure you saw that on your vocab list. It was, I know, over 90 terms long. So we are going to cover a lot of information. It just isn't going to take a lot of time. I'm going to be moving pretty quickly. So if you're having trouble keeping up, just let me know. So this unit is two parts. The first part is imperialism, and then part 2 is the progressive era. So we'll start with imperialism now and get to the progressive era probably day 3 or 4 is when we'll start with that. So to talk about imperialism in the United States, first you got to know what imperialism is. So imperialism is the policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. So you see this picture here. It's the United States flag, and it's sort of grabbing hold of the world. That's sort of what imperialism is. It's not necessarily conquering other countries, although that is part of that is imperialism. But imperialism is not only that, it's important to get that diplomacy piece too. If it means that you are providing aid to another country, that's diplomacy and that's imperialism. If you are, expanding your military and including a base on another country, that's imperialism. So all things like that are wrapped up into American imperialism. So the first real imperialists for America, the first active promoters of American interests, were actually missionaries. So if you see this picture right up here, this is a group of This is one lady here with a group of people who she was ministering to. So missionaries are people who go out and spread their religion, whether it be in other cities, states, or countries. And missionaries are largely Christian. So we've got Christian missionaries leaving the United States. Most of them were actually going to China at this point. A lot of our mission work was directed at China. But we also go to other countries as well, but China's a big part of it. That's where that picture was from. So the amount of missionaries we see is really going to grow between 1870 and 1900. After that, we're also going to see businessmen looking to expand their interests outside of the United States. Industrialists, traders, inventors. People are looking for investors from other countries. They're looking to invest in other countries. They're looking to build companies in other places, export their product to other places. So we're going to see a lot of companies go international, like Kodak Camera, Singer Sewing Machine, Standard Oil, J.D. Rockefeller's company, American Tobacco, one of the largest tobacco and cigarette companies, and then International Harvester, which is a tractor company that's still around and make farming equipment. So by 1914, foreign investment is going to be 7% of our gross national product, which is pretty impressive to go from nothing at all to 7%. Today, I would say it could be 30%. It's a lot more today. But back then, it was really a lot to have 7% of all the money we're making be coming from other countries. So we're going to start talking about, our sphere of influence. Economics is just the beginning of expanding our sphere of influence. We want to expand our political influence as well. So we start talking about who we want in our sphere of influence. And that basically we're saying, what people do we want to bring into this bubble of the United States? And who do we want to be able to have some type of control over? We're trying to be the puppet masters. So we decide on 2 places in particular. We want to expand our sphere of influence to the Caribbean as well as Asia. So this guy here on the far right, this is Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan. I know it can be tough to see the ER on the end of his name because his jacket is black and his name's in front of it. But Admiral Thayer Mahan published a book called the influence of sea power upon history. And that makes sense, right? He was an admiral, which means he was in the Navy. So it makes sense that he would want to write a book about how the ocean and the Navy has impacted world history. And basically what he says is that every empire has had one thing in common, and that's been a really strong Navy, whether you talk about the Greeks or the Romans or the British more recently, even the Spanish. They've all had a solid control over at least the seas around them, if not more. So he says if the United States wants to expand their power, then they need to build up their Navy, and they need to start taking control of smaller islands surrounding the United States, like Hawaii and some other places. So that's exactly what we're going to do. In the 1890s, this is the first time we get involved in Hawaiian affairs. That's when Grover Cleveland, we've got here on the right, is going to start making that happen. So Hawaii back then was its own independent nation, and it was actually a monarchy, and but a lot of Americans actually lived in Hawaii as plantation owners, largely producing sugarcane. To grow sugarcane, you need quite a bit of like water. You need a more tropical or swampy climate. You might know of sugarcane plantations in places like Louisiana or Florida. So Hawaii makes sense that it would be a good environment for them. So the relationship between the sugarcane plantation owners and the native Hawaiians was not really a good one. Tensions were pretty high, and it was starting to upset the economic and political stability. And the Americans wanted to make sure that whoever was in control of the political structure in Hawaii was someone who was going to favor them. They wanted to make sure that they would take their side and pursue American interests in Hawaii. So the Americans and the plantation owners in 1891 dispose of the Hawaiian king. They get rid of him, and they put a new monarch in power, and this is her on the far left here, Queen Liliuokalani. So Queen Liliuokalani is going to be in control for a couple of years, and she really tries to establish her independence. And she is not trying to just be a puppet of these American plantation owners. You know, she's trying to do what she thinks is going to be for the betterment of all of Hawaii, especially the native Hawaiians. But that's not what the Americans wanted, right? They put her in power so that they could basically control her, and it's not working. She's not just sort of bending to their will like they hoped she would. So the planters, the plantationers, accompanied this time by American soldiers, who you can see in both of these pictures here under Grover Cleveland's face, they actually overthrow Liliuokalani. And in 1893, Grover Cleveland declares Hawaii a protectorate. A protectorate is not the same thing as a territory, but it's similar. We have more control over territory than a protectorate. But basically we're saying we're not going to put anyone in charge of Hawaii right now because we don't trust anyone. It's going to be us. The U.S. government is now going to be sort of monitoring the situation in Hawaii, and they're going to get involved. So, since then, obviously Hawaii is a state now. So its path after that was eventually to become a territory, and then eventually in the 20th century, later 20th century, will become a state. So we've got another feeling that's spreading throughout the world, contributing to all of this imperialism that is not necessarily, contained to the United States. This is all over the place, and it's called jingoism. So jingoism is a swaggering foreign policy with this willingness to go to war, to just make your country seem better. Everyone's, so willing to go to war. It's sort of like nationalism with war mixed in. If you remember when we talked about nationalism, that is wanting to pursue the interests of your nation over the interests of your region, having this great pride in your nation. Well, jingoism is that, but wanting to prove that through war. So this definition here on the slide says jingoism is the extreme belief that your own country is always best, which is often shown in enthusiastic support for a war against another country. So this isn't just the United States, okay, that's willing to fight people to prove how great we are. This is happening in France. This is happening in Great Britain. This is happening in Germany. This is happening in Japan. So if you think about what type of how we are in the timeline of the world here, it's 1898, and we're about to be in the 20th century. And what's one of the first things that's one of the first major events that's going to happen in the 20th century is going to be World War I. So it makes sense that pretty soon all of this jingoism is going to lead all of these countries to actually go to war with each other as a whole. So this is a very aggressive form of foreign policy. And there's a quote by a guy who was a senator at the time who said the number of men and officials in this country who are now mad to fight somebody is appalling. Like, everyone is sort of just walking around ready to fight someone to prove how great America is. Like, if France looks at us weird, or just like, okay, let's take this outside, we're trying to fight it out, type of thing. It's a very, like I said, aggressive way of going about your business. So eventually this is going to lead us into some problems with Spain. So for several hundred years, Cuba has been under Spanish control. Now, remember, we're starting to pay attention to Cuba a little bit now because we were looking to expand our sphere of influence to what two places? The Caribbean and Asia. Cuba is in /near the Caribbean. So we are sort of starting to look at and see what's going on in Cuba. Now, in 1868, the Cubans revolt against the Spanish. They had been under Spanish control for quite some time. And they start this rebellion in 1868. It's going to take Spain 10 years to regain their full control over Cuba. A 10-year battle with the Cubans. That's very, very long. That's a very long rebellion. Then in 1895, Cuba tries it again, and they rebel against the Spanish again. And this time, the Cubans were like, we can't do this for another 10 years. We've got to go hard so that we can get this done quickly. And at the same time, the Spanish were like, no, we can't do this for another 10 years. We've got to crush the Cubans swiftly and quickly to make sure that this is all over. So the Cubans start destroying large parts of the island to make it uninhabitable, basically making it seem like if the land is so bad, maybe the Spanish won't want it. Maybe they won't want to be there. The Spanish, on the other hand, use very savage military tactics, and they're going to slaughter the Cubans in droves. The Spanish military leader, the general in command of the Spanish army in Cuba, was this guy on the far right, Valeriano Weyler. His nickname was the Butcher, Butcher Weyler. So Weyler actually was using concentration camps, forcing large numbers of Cubans into concentration camps. 20,000 Cubans are going to die of just starvation and disease. That doesn't count the number of Cubans that were killed or executed. So this picture here beside Valeriano is of dead Cubans in this concentration camp, and these are like Spanish soldiers who are walking through. I'm sure they're sort of coming up with a plan on how to dispose of all of these bodies. So all of this is going on in the United States. We're just starting to hear about it. So if you remember, we were talking about in the last unit the new type of strategy that our newspapers are using to increase circulation and to sell more papers. It's called yellow journalism, publishing shocking and sensational stories in vivid detail, putting the craziest stuff on the front page just to sell more papers. That's yellow journalism. So William Randolph Hearst, owner of the New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer, owner of the New York World, they're both really the pioneers of this strategy. And they latch on to these stories about this, what the Spanish are doing in Cuba. And people are reading about this, what the Spanish are doing to the Cubans, and they're outraged. And they start putting a lot of pressure on President McKinley to do something. People are reading about all this. I mean, you can imagine if your social media, if your Twitter feed one day was just flooded with images of the Spanish forcing Cubans into concentration camps and slaughtering them in droves, you can imagine people would start saying, like, what is Trump doing? What's going on? Why isn't the president stepping in? What are we going to do about this? What's the UN doing? Now, we didn't have some type of large peacekeeping group at this time like the UN. So if anyone's going to stop it from happening, it's going to be an independent country. So that's why McKinley is getting so much pressure put on him to do something about this. So he finally decides that he'll talk to the Spanish and see if he can get things to calm down a little.